Pat Nash. I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture entitled, Do Not Be Ashamed of the Gospel, Bearing Moral Witness in the Public Square by Dr. Robert George. St. Gregory the Great Parish is the Catholic Church present in Hamilton Square in Robbinsville. And our evangelization team is comprised of men and women devoted to spreading the good news of Jesus Christ within our own parish family as well as to the community at large. Tonight's speaker, Robert P. George, is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He has also taught at Harvard Law School. He has served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and as a presidential appointee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He has also served on the President's Council on Bioethics and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization's World Commission on the Ethics of Science and Technology. He was a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Swarthmore College, he holds degrees in law and theology from Harvard and a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University, in addition to many honorary degrees. He's a recipient of the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal and the Honorific Medal for the Defense of Human Rights of the Republic of Poland, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor George is the author of many books, including The Clash of Orthodoxies from Intercollegiate Studies Institute from 2001, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life, second edition Doubleday, 2011, Conscience and Its Enemies, ISI Books, 2013, and Conjugal Union, What Marriage Is and Why It Matters, co-authored with Patrick Lee. That's from Cambridge University Press, 2014. Professor George's talk tonight, Do Not Be Ashamed of the Gospel, Bearing Moral Witness in the Public Square, is relevant and important to us here at St. Gregory's because our Lord Jesus Christ and our Catholic Church call us to evangelize, to spread the gospel in our world, including to those places where the gospel has not yet been preached or to places where it is not welcome. Professor George can give us insights as to how we can talk about the gospel in those places, particularly in the so-called public square, that place where all citizens, people of all beliefs and traditions, have the freedom to walk and talk, where we as a society as a whole decide who we are and who we will be, to borrow words from the Center for Religious Expression. As you know, at this time in our history, we find it particularly challenging to share the good news in two major areas of morality: that life begins at conception, and perhaps one that's even more difficult to talk about, challenging, is that marriage is a conjugal union between one man and one woman that is permanent, exclusive, and open to children. Professor George tonight will help us to understand better the current cultural, political, legal climate in which we live, and will offer wisdom as to how we can spread those teachings courageously and effectively. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Robert George.
Thank you, Father Mike. Good. Would it be possible for me to stand up closer? Does
I'll move that back.
Can you move that back? I don't want to be too far away from my audience. If you want to throw things, I want them to actually reach me. I am so proud of Father Mike McLean. When he was listing my accomplishments, and I'm very grateful for that generous introduction, Father, when he was listing my accomplishments, he left out the most important one, which was that I was the teacher at Princeton of Father Mike McLean. We hated to give him up at St. Paul's, where he had his first assignment as our parochial vicar, but we know that you needed him here at St. Gregory's. So you have him on loan. We really would like to have him back sometime. Share. And thank you for coming out this evening to hear me. I know that there are many, many other things that you could be doing with your Tuesday evening, and I'm grateful to you for coming and listening to what I have to say. The Catholic story. the gospel story is a rich and variegated story. It's a story that includes joy and consolation. Our great Pope, Pope Francis, entitled his first encyclical letter, Joy and Hope. I think I have that right. I might be confusing it with the Vatican. I'm confusing it with the Vatican Council's document, Gaudium et Spes. It's the joy of the gospel, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. And it is a story that's full of joy and consolation. And consolation. Now, this evening, what I have to say will be only part of the story. I'm not going to, on this occasion, talk much about the joy of the gospel. I don't mean by that to underplay it or to leave it out, but since I have just a few minutes of your time, I want to focus this evening on the challenge of the gospel, the hard part, at least under the conditions we find ourselves laboring with today in our own societies. We struggle to be good Christians, to be good Catholics, to be witnesses for Christ in our own community here of the church and in what Father called the public square. So I don't mean to make this a complete downer. I don't want you to think that I don't believe that the gospel is full of joy. The gospel is full of joy, but this evening I'm going to focus on the challenging side. And so my message is somewhat grim. And that's because the days of socially acceptable Christianity are over. The days of comfortable Catholic orthodoxy are past. Some of us are old enough to remember when it was relatively easy to be a good and faithful and orthodox Catholic in the United States. Sure, there was anti-Catholicism. We all remember that too. And yet, one could proceed with life not worrying about paying a very heavy price for being a Catholic. But now I think those days really are over. It's no longer easy in our public life to be a faithful Christian, a good Catholic, an authentic witness to the truths of the gospel. Rather, a price is demanded and must be paid. There are what the great hero, the great anti-Nazi Protestant hero, the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, called costs of discipleship. There are costs of discipleship. And these costs are burdensome and not easy to bear. Indeed, they can be painful to bear. Now, of course, one can still safely identify oneself as a Catholic and even be seen going to Mass. And that's because the guardians of those norms we have come to call political correctness, those cultural norms we call political correctness, do not assume that identifying oneself as a Catholic or even going to church necessarily means that one actually believes what the church teaches, or that one is prepared to stand up for what the church proclaims, especially on issues such as the two that Father put the emphasis on in his introduction: marriage and sexual morality, the sanctity of human life. In a way, it's a sadness, isn't it, that the enforcers of these cultural norms cannot simply infer that because a person identifies himself or herself as a good Catholic and goes to church, that they are pro-life and pro-marriage. But because that's the case, if you want to identify as a Catholic and be safe, you can do it, as long as you keep your mouth shut. Now, if one does not believe what the church teaches, or for now at least, even if one does believe those teachings but is prepared to be completely silent about them, one is safe. one can still be a comfortable Christian. In other words, a tame Catholic, a Catholic who is ashamed of the gospel or who is willing to act, at least in public, as if he or she were ashamed of the gospel, is still socially acceptable. But a Catholic who makes clear that he or she is not ashamed even of the teachings of the church that challenge the norms of cultural orthodoxy, must be prepared to take risks and make sacrifices. Must be prepared, in other words, to pay Bonhoeffer's costs of discipleship. The saving message of the gospel of Jesus Christ includes integrally the teachings of his church on the profound and inherent and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family, from the child in the womb to the severely cognitively disabled or handicapped person, to the frail elderly person at the other edge of life. Every human being, no matter how weak, no matter how frail, no matter how vulnerable, how neglected, how looked down on, even the child hidden in the womb is a bearer of that same profound, inherent, and equal dignity. That's what our church proclaims. And if we are faithful Catholics, that's what we hold and stand for. And it's also integrally part of the saving message of the gospel that marriage is what Father just called a conjugal bond. That is, the lifelong, permanent, exclusive sexual partnership of husband and wife. Man and woman, bound together in unity, not simply at the affective or emotional level, but at every level of being. That's what it means to say that special union of spouses, unlike the relationship of friends or other familial relationships with our children, with our siblings, with our cousins, that's what it means to say that marriage is a conjugal relationship. It's a sharing not merely at the affective or emotional level, but at every level. The biological, bodily level, the psychological, emotive level, the rational, volitional level, the level at which we think and choose, and the spiritual level. That's what's unique and distinctive about marriage as a conjugal bond. But of course, the Church's long-standing belief, and the belief not only of the Church, but of all the great traditions of human history, not simply the religious traditions, but even the great traditions of secular philosophy, one finds the same message in the writings of the great Greek pagan philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, Xenophanes, the Roman Stoic Musonius Rufus, Plutarch, all the way up to Mahatma Gandhi, from the Hindu tradition, teaching exactly the same idea proclaimed by the Church of marriage as a conjugal bond. The idea articulated in Revelation, in our own tradition and in the Jewish tradition from which ours is drawn, articulated in the language of Genesis 2, where we're told that a man shall leave his mother and home and cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. The bond, in other words, is not merely at the affective level. Any two people can have an emotional bond. Two people of the same sex. Doesn't have to be two. 3 people, 5 can have an emotional bond. What the Bible is teaching us about marriage is that it is more than merely an emotional bond. It unites husband and wife at every level. Foundationally, at the biological level, one flesh. union. Not just one mind union. Husbands and wives, at least in my experience, have to struggle a bit to have a common mind. But we're pretty good at forming a one flesh union. And that is the foundation and matrix of the comprehensive sharing of life that marriage is so beautifully proclaimed by our church. A church that has been faithful to this teaching through thick and thin for 2,000 years. And yet today, not only is it rejected by so many, even some within the church, it's held up to scorn, ridicule. Proclaiming it can bring upon us abuse. And yet we're called to endure that, to pay the costs of discipleship, because these teachings about life and marriage are not mere sideshows. They are integral parts of the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. If you believe his gospel, you believe his church. If you believe his church, you believe what his church teaches on these fundamental issues. Now, these teachings are not, don't misunderstand me, these teachings are not the whole gospel. There's a lot more to the gospel than simply the teachings on life and marriage. Christianity requires much more than that. But even having said that, we must never forget, especially under circumstances where we may be strongly tempted to forget, that these teachings are integral to the gospel. They are not optional or dispensable. We can't go into the shop and say, I'll take this one and this one and this one, but not that one and the other one. It's a package. It's the whole thing, or it ain't the gospel. To be an authentic witness to the gospel is therefore to proclaim these truths among the rest, not in isolation from all our other gospel responsibilities. Care for the poor, care for the great creation that God gave us stewardship over, conduct ourselves fairly in business and our other dealings with other people, tell the truth, do not tell lies. Christianity lays a comprehensive burden of moral obligation on us. But this is part of it, integral to it, no less than the other teachings about the poor, about our obligations in fairness, about our obligations to be good stewards of creation. It's a complete package. The gospel is, as Pope John Paul II famously taught us, a gospel of life. An evangelium vitae. And our gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ, is a gospel of family life too. The family built on the conjugal love of husband and wife. And it is these integral dimensions of the gospel, its teachings on life and marriage, that powerful cultural forces and currents today demand that we Catholics deny or suppress. You want to get ahead? You want to be acceptable? You want to get along? Better go quiet on those or deny them altogether. Be one of the club. If, Jesus said, if anyone wants to be my disciple, let him take up his cross and follow me. This has always struck me as an amazing, perhaps even conclusive, definitive truth and proof of the truth of Christianity. Christianity must be true, because if it were false, it could never have come up with such an unbelievable teaching. And by unbelievable, I don't mean awesome like the kids say. I mean really difficult to believe. Now imagine this. Imagine this. You're an early Christian. You're an early Christian. And you're told by, let's say, the apostle who founded your church, St. John or St. Peter. Okay, now, as a Christian, you're an evangelist. The Lord has told us, go out and make disciples of all nations. Got that? Got that, boss. Now, we got a great message, and we want you to go out and sell that message. If you become a Christian, don't worry. It's not going to make you rich. It's not going to make you famous. It's not going to make you popular. Well, boss, but what's the good thing then? How do I sell this message? What's the good part? How do I convince people to adopt Christianity? What do I tell them they get for it? Oh, you tell them that to be a Christian, when you become a Christian, what that will mean is you have to take up your cross on which people are crucified and follow Christ. Great. Wonderful product. Any of you in sales? Anybody in sales? I'd like to try to sell that product. Tough product to sell. And yet, that's the message. It's the opposite of what's sometimes called the prosperity gospel. You buy into this gospel, good things happen to you in this life. That's not the gospel of Jesus Christ. Not as the Catholic Church proclaims the gospel. No. To be a Christian, Jesus himself tells us, I mean, this isn't third hand. Jesus says to be a Christian means to take up your cross and follow me. And yet, we in the West, and especially here in the United States of America, we Catholics, having had it so good, having been comfortable, having been acceptable, having prospered, having had the most wonderful educational opportunities, having been able to rise up in the social ladder. Many of us had immigrant parents or immigrant grandparents who came with nothing. They built these wonderful churches with contributing pennies to the collection plate and so forth, so that their children, you and me, or their grandchildren, could be professional people, could have their own homes, could have secure retirements and so forth. We've had it good. And we've been acceptable. We've never had to apologize for being a Catholic. Our neighbors accept us. We don't get criticized. Nobody calls us names. Until now. So having had it so good, having been comfortable, and having gotten used to it. You get used to being comfortable. I do. I get used to it. I come to think of it as an entitlement. I'm entitled to be comfortable. But having been comfortable, having had it so good, we have forgotten or ignored that timeless gospel truth. If you want to be my disciple, Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. And by follow me, you know what he means. He doesn't mean let's go to the grocery store. He doesn't mean let's go to the skating rink. He means let's go to Golgotha, to the place of the skull, the place of death, to crucifixion. Well, there will be no ignoring it now. We can't escape it, even if we want to. Those powerful currents and forces that I mentioned in our society press us to be ashamed of the gospel, ashamed of our faith's teachings on the sanctity of human life in all stages and conditions, ashamed of our faith's teachings on marriage as the conjugal union of husband and wife. You know that that's what we're getting. You know that that's what we're being told when you yourself feel, as I myself have felt, in social circumstances, in professional circumstances, in circumstances we find ourselves in, when we feel ourselves holding back from revealing our views about life or about marriage. Where's that pressure coming from? Do you hold back your views about the Phillies or the Steelers or Beyonce? No, but we hold back. We're feeling those pressures. Pressures to be ashamed of our faith. These forces insist that the church's teachings in these areas are out of date, retrograde, insensitive, uncompassionate, illiberal, bigoted, even hateful. These currents bring pressure on all of us and on young Christians, our children and grandchildren in particular, to yield to its insistence. We older folk think we have it tough. The pressure on our kids and our grandkids is tremendous. The pressure to conform, to go along. They threaten us, these forces, with consequences if we refuse to go along, if we refuse to call what is good evil and what is evil good. They command us to conform our thinking to their orthodoxy, to trade the gospel of Christ for a different gospel, or else just keep silent. Keep your head down and your mouth shut. Now, we as faithful Catholics believe that truth in its fullness is truth about the dignity of the human person and the nature of marriage. We believe the same truths that have been proclaimed by our church again for 2,000 years, without fail, firmly and constantly. If anybody has told you otherwise, ask me about it in the Q&A afterward. We believe that every member of the human family, irrespective of age or size or stage of development or condition of dependency, is indeed the bearer of a profound, inherent, and equal dignity and right to life. No exceptions. If any of us has dignity, all of us have dignity. We have dignity, even people we don't know, even people we don't like, because they, like us, are made in the very image and likeness of the divine creator and ruler of the universe. That's our view. That's our belief. That's what the gospel teaches us. It's also defensible by purely rational inquiry and analysis. But we believe it's also revealed by God Himself. There's nobody who doesn't count. There's nobody who can be thrown overboard. There's nobody who can be exposed to lethal violence. Everybody is a bearer of this dignity. We hold that the precious child in the womb, as a creature made in the very image and likeness of God, deserves our respect and protection just as much as the newborn child, as the adolescent, as the adult, at any stage, in any condition. We do not believe people come in classes: superior, whose rights need to be respected, and inferior, who have no rights. This is not our view. There have been people who held such things. There are people who hold such things today. It's not us, because the gospel teaches us that everybody is a superior. There are no inferiors. In the language of our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. So powerful people and institutions say, because we insist on the inherent dignity even of the child in the womb, that we are misogynists. We pose a threat to people's right to privacy. We are enemies of women's reproductive freedom. You've all heard this. You've probably been accused of this if you've ever spoken up in defense of unborn babies. That's what we are confronted with. It's by that language that they seek to intimidate us, to bully us into acquiescence, or at least silence. I mean, who wants to be called bad names? Nobody likes that. It's no fun. Take it from me, it's no fun. We believe that the core social function of marriage is to unite a man and woman as husband and wife, to be mother and father to children born of their union. We hold that the norms that shape marriage as a truly conjugal partnership, norms such as fidelity, exclusivity, the commitment to permanence, as difficult as it is sometimes to get along. We believe all of these norms come from the nature of marriage as a child-centered institution. Marriage as an institution is grounded in its procreative nature, its singular aptness for the project of child-rearing. We understand marriage as the uniquely comprehensive type of bond, comprehensive in that it unites spouses in a bodily way, as I said before, and not merely at the emotional level of hearts and minds, that is oriented to and would naturally be fulfilled by their conceiving and rearing children together. Even a marriage that cannot be fruitful in children, say because the wife is beyond childbearing, or the husband has some defect that makes it impossible for him to be fertile. Still, when they enter into a marriage, they enter into the kind of relationship that is oriented to and would naturally be fulfilled by their having and rearing children together. It's that type of relationship. That is what makes the relationship the kind of relationship it is and distinguishes it from every other kind of relationship. A sibling relationship, a parent-child relationship, the relationship of ordinary friends. The marital relationship is the kind of relationship that is consummated and actualized by acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation. And it remains just that, whether or not the non-behavioral conditions of procreation happen to obtain. To have a baby, you need two things, right? The behavioral conditions of procreation have to be fulfilled. You got to know, how to get that done. But also there are non-behavioral conditions that must obtain, or else there won't be a baby. The non-behavioral conditions are beyond human control and do not matter. The behavioral conditions are, the fulfilling of the behavioral conditions is precisely what actualizes, initially consummates marriage and actualizes marriage. Are any of you watching Wolf Hall? Anybody? Yeah, there are a few people watching Wolf Hall. Okay. Really lousy history. Don't believe any of it. Enjoy it, though. Enjoy it. It's a great story, and enjoy the story. But for those of you who are watching it, it's about Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII and Thomas More. Like A Man for All Seasons, only not as good. It's the Protestant version of A Man for All Seasons. I shouldn't have said that. Erase that from the tape. But you'll remember in Wolf Hall, and even if you remember A Man for All Seasons, Thomas More, one of the key questions that Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell are wrestling with is the problem that arises because King Henry VIII wants a new wife. He doesn't like the old wife. The old wife, Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, has not been able to produce an heir for him. So he wants out of the marriage so he can marry the new apple of his eye, whose name is Anne Boleyn. The problem is he had gotten a dispensation from the Pope to marry Catherine in the first place because Catherine had been married to his brother who died. So to marry her, he needs a dispensation. Now, to get the dispensation, the lawyers on behalf of Henry and Catherine, who wanted to get married, they initially liked each other, had to go to the Pope and say Catherine's marriage to the former king had never been consummated. Pope said, okay, if it hadn't been consummated, it's not actually a finalized, complete marriage. That's because on the Catholic understanding, which absolutely all those people shared, the Pope obviously, but also Henry and Catherine and all the officials of England and all the officials of Spain, marriage was a bodily relationship, a conjugal relationship. Now later when Henry wanted out, because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, he goes back to the Pope and says, remember what I told you about Catherine's marriage not being consummated? I was wrong. It was consummated, therefore your dispensation is illegal. I'm living in sin with my brother's widow. You got to let me out. And by the way, if you do, I'm going to marry Anne Boleyn. But that dimension of things really mattered because of the nature of marriage as a bodily relationship, one that is naturally oriented to and would be fulfilled by having and rearing children together. And yet, for holding such a view, powerful people and institutions say that we, Catholics and our evangelical friends and our Orthodox Jewish friends and others who share this view, whether they are Christians or not, are homophobes, bigots, people who don't believe in equality, marriage equality. They even claim that we represent a threat to people's safety. I don't know if any of you saw Frank Bruni's op-ed piece in the New York Times this weekend, where he told the Christian church, change your teachings. Change your teachings on homosexuality. Yep, change it. You say it's a sin. Change that. Got that? Change it. Now, I don't know who made Frank Bruni Pope, but he thinks he can order the church to change. But of course the church can't change, no matter what names they call us. It's integral to the gospel message, the saving and liberating message of the gospel of family life, that this is indeed what marriage is. So when we are invited or pressured to distance ourselves from these teachings or to go silent about them, when we are threatened with opprobrium or the loss of professional opportunities or social standing if we do not capitulate, we are being pressured to be ashamed of the gospel, which means to give up active, true, living, vital faith in the lordship of Jesus Christ and in the hope of his triumph, his righteousness, and his love. We're being asked to give all of that up to be acceptable, to be able to avoid being called names, to be able to avoid being criticized. To be a witness to the gospel today in its fullness is to make oneself, in a certain sense, a marked man or woman, even if you don't teach at Princeton University. It's to expose oneself to scorn and reproach, to unashamedly proclaim the gospel in its fullness, is to place in jeopardy, quite possibly, one's security, the security of one's position, to risk one's personal aspirations and ambitions. For our precious young people, some of the students that I teach, for example, Catholics, evangelicals, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, they realize if they speak out, and many bravely do, God bless them, for life or for marriage, they are placing at risk their academic and professional futures. We may be placing at risk the peace and tranquility we enjoy, our standing in polite society. One may, in consequence of one's public witness, be discriminated against and denied educational opportunities and the prestigious credentials that they may offer. One may lose valuable opportunities for employment and professional advancement. One may be excluded from worldly recognition and honors of various sorts. One's witness might even cost one treasured friendships. It may produce familial discord. So many families today experience that discord. And even the alienation of some family members. All right, if you stand for what the church teaches, I'm out of here. I'm not going to put up with that. You're a bigot. You're my mother and I love you, but you're a bigot. You're my father, but you're a bigot. Yes, there are costs of discipleship, heavy costs. Remember that passage in the gospel? So hard to hear, so hard to hear. That passage in the gospel when Jesus says, Father, correct me if I have this wrong, that unless you hate your mother and your father, your brother and your sister, your son or daughter, you do not love me. Man, when you hear that, when I hear that, I say, whoa, wait a minute. My goodness, I love my mom and dad. My brothers, my children. Jesus can't be saying that. This can't be the gospel. What about all the love and everything, right? Unless you hate. Now, of course, we have to understand Jesus isn't telling us to hate our parents. I mean, obviously that would contradict the fourth commandment. The teachee becomes the teacher. And Jesus tells us he doesn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So it can't be what he means. What he was preparing us for was precisely things like this. In other words, if it should come to it where you have to choose between Christ and even one's most cherished relationships, one's beloved family relationships, you must be faithful to the gospel. Now, is that a hard teaching or what? I mean, that's just a really hard teaching. Now, this is where we pray like Jesus in the garden, let this cup pass me by. I don't want that. Ask me something, demand something, just ask me anything else, anything but that. So yes, there are heavy costs of discipleship, heavy costs. So for us, there's no avoiding the question, am I unwilling to stand with Christ in proclaiming his truths? That's the question. Am I unwilling or am I willing? Am I willing to do it no matter the costs, or does there come a point where I say, Jesus, that's just asking too much. I can do some of it, I can't do all of it. I'm sorry, I jump off here. I get off at this stop. If we are prepared to say, we go the whole way with you, Jesus, we're all in, then the days of comfortable Christianity for us really are over. Fearing to place in jeopardy the wealth we've piled up, the businesses we've built, the professional and social standing we've earned, the security and tranquility we enjoy, the opportunities for worldly advancement we cherish, the connections we have cultivated, the relationships we treasure. Some of us, alas, will undoubtedly go the other way and say, I'm not all in. I can go only so far and no further. And thus we will silently, perhaps, acquiesce to the destruction of innocent human lives in the womb or the demolition of marriage, keeping our mouths shut, keeping our heads down. The challenge of our faith as Catholic Christians today does not come to us in the form that it came to Peter, to St. Peter. Do you remember the form in which the challenge to Peter's faith came? When Jesus was brought before Herod and then before Pilate, when he was betrayed in the garden. It's early in the morning on Good Friday. Peter's warming himself beside the fire. Things are looking very bleak. Jesus is being scourged, beaten. And a maid asks Peter, surely you are this man's disciple. And Peter says, I don't know him. Later she says, but you have to be. Your accent gives you away. You're a Galilean. And then he swore and said, I tell you I do not know the man. That's how it came to Peter. Now we like to think, don't we? That, oh man, had we been there, we'd have stood for Jesus. We wouldn't have said, I don't know the man. We'd have been good Christians, good disciples of Christ. We'd have said, I am indeed his disciple. Well, we're being tested right now. But it's not with the same words. It's not, do you know the man? It's, do you stand for the sanctity of human life in all stages and conditions? Do you stand for the dignity of marriage as the union of husband and wife? And how many of us will say, in effect, I do not know the man? These powerful forces do indeed tell us to make things worse and harder for us. They tell us, you know what, you guys, you Catholics, you evangelicals, you Orthodox Jews, you believers, you people of faith, you traditionalists, your defeat is inevitable. We're beating you. Look what we did to you in Indiana. It's over. We're winning. Your history. They warn us that we are on the wrong side of history. Have you heard that? Heard people say that? You're on the wrong side of history. Church better get on the right side of history. You Catholics better get on the right side of history. They insist that we will be judged by future generations the way we today judge those who championed racial segregation in the Jim Crow South. But my friends, here at St. Gregory's, history does not have sides. History is an impersonal and contingent sequence of events. That is all it is. Events that are determined in decisive ways by human deliberation, judgment, choice, and action. Yours and mine. History is contingent, not determined. The future of marriage and of countless human lives can and will be determined by our judgments and choices, our willingness or unwillingness to bear faithful and courageous witness, our acts of courage or cowardice. Nor is history or future generations a judge invested with godlike powers to decide, much less dictate, who was right and who was wrong. Do not fall for this silly nonsense, and that's all it is, silly nonsense, about being on the right side of history. There is no such thing. The idea of a judgment of history is secularism's vain, meaningless, hopeless, and pathetic attempt to devise a substitute, a secular substitute, for what religious faith, Jewish, Christian, Muslim alike, knows as the final judgment of Almighty God. History, this impersonal sequence of events, is not God. God is God. History is not our judge. God is our judge. One day, each of us, not as a corporate body, each of us as individual persons, will give an account before the throne of Almighty God for all we have done and failed to do. Let no one suppose that we will be making this accounting to some impersonal sequence of events possessing no more power to judge than a golden calf or a carved and painted totem pole. It will be before God, the God of truth, the God of history, that we will stand. And as we tremble in His presence, it will be no use for any of us, for you or for me or for anyone else, to claim that we did everything in our power to put ourselves on the right side of history. That's not going to be what God wants to know. One thing and one thing alone will matter. Was I a faithful witness to the gospel? Did I do everything in my power to place myself on the side of truth? The Lord who is the way, the truth, and the life. And that Lord will want to know from each of us whether we sought the truth with a pure and sincere heart, whether we sought to live by the truth authentically and with integrity, and whether we stood up for the truth, speaking it out loud and in public, bearing the costs of discipleship that are inevitably imposed on faithful witnesses to truth by cultures that turn away from God and His law? Or are we ashamed of the gospel? Thank you. So I'd be very happy to talk with you and have some conversation. Father, is that kosher? Is that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry?
Passover's not over yet.
Passover's not over. That's exactly right. Yeah, 8 days. 8 days. Passover and Easter have lined up this year. It's very unusual, very rare for that to happen. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Speak up loudly. In my old age, I'm getting hard of hearing.
Years ago, I remember reading some sort of tract on marriage. They made a distinction between a covenant of God and the legal, civil contract of marriage. And would you like to expound on that?
Yeah, that's something the Catholic Church, that's a distinction the Catholic Church does not recognize or believe in.
Okay.
And that's because we believe that marriage is not simply a religious act. In fact, we believe that people who are not even religious believers can be married. We believe that though marriage is elevated by Christ to the status of a sacrament, when the marriage is between baptized Christians, a completely valid and legitimate marriage can be contracted even between unbaptized persons, or a baptized Christian and an unbaptized person, even between people who've never heard of the gospel, never heard of the witness to Israel, never heard of the Bible, or even people who are not monotheists. And that's because the church understands marriage as a natural human good. Elevated, yes, to sacramental status, but there grace is perfecting nature. It's not replacing it, it's not destroying it, it's not substituting for it. It's elevating. So we are not of the school that says, well, you know, there's this one thing that is called marriage, it's just a mere contract. We don't need to be concerned about that in society. We just need to be concerned with making sure that we protect the sanctity and integrity of sacramental marriage. Not the Catholic view. Some of you will probably remember, those of you who have done some philosophy or perhaps went to Catholic colleges and universities in the old days, the Catholic Church believes in the idea of natural law, that there's a moral law, as St. Paul says in his second chapter of the letter of the Romans, written on the hearts even of the Gentiles who don't have the law of Moses, a law that's sufficient for moral accountability and even ultimately for divine judgment. And the knowledge of the good of marriage is one of those laws written on the hearts even of the Gentiles who do not have the law of Moses, don't have the revelation. And as I mentioned earlier, the church's teaching on this basic idea of marriage as a natural human good is prefigured in the works of Plato, Aristotle, Xenophanes, Musonius, Plutarch, the great thinkers of antiquity, both on the Greek and on the Roman side. There is nothing novel. There's nothing, get this folks, there's nothing distinctively Catholic. When people say you're trying to impose your Catholic view of marriage on the public and that's a violation of separation of church and state or whatever it is they're saying, I'm always tempted to say, well, look, honestly, nothing would please me more than to be able to claim Aristotle, my great hero, as a Catholic. But, he wasn't. But he got the basic insight, as did his great teacher Plato. What you're imposing, if anybody's imposing anything, is a principle of rationality that is cross-cultural and across time. Gandhi held a view very close to the view of the Catholic Church, down to, by the way, the complete rejection of contraception. Gandhi. Your friends who admire Gandhi so much, tell them about that. Yep. You had a hand up, sir.
I hope you can prove me wrong. But you're saying they and we.
Yeah.
Are you referring to government? They?
No.
Come on, I think you are. All right, anyway. Because we are the church and they are the government. Who lay the laws out? Why doesn't the Catholic Church say anything? The reason I think they don't want to say anything, they're afraid to lose their tax status.
Oh.
And right now,
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not the Catholic Church and the government, because the resistance to Catholic teaching comes from far more than the government. And the government itself is divided. You disagree with that?
Yes.
Okay. The Princeton faculty, are they the government? Guess what? They all disagree with me. I'm sorry?
Colleges are the worst places.
Oh, you won't have any argument from me there. But they're not the government. I'll tell you a little story. When I was a student, I went to law school at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in the town, we had, right in the middle of town, an Armenian Catholic church. It wasn't, most Armenians are Orthodox, but there's a small Armenian Uniate Catholic community, and they had a little church in the center of town. I used to go to the church sometimes. It was a very small church. There was a priest there named Father Luke, and he was a wonderful old Armenian priest. And usually it was just a few very elderly Armenian ladies and me. So one day I was there for Sunday Mass with a friend of mine who was interested in coming and did come into the church, a law school classmate of mine who became a Catholic. Anyway, he was at that point still considering becoming a Catholic, but he went to church with me, and we were there at Father Luke's church, and it was Super Bowl Sunday. I can probably pinpoint this. It must have been about, I don't know, right, 1980, something like that. So Father Luke, in his homily, which he gave in English, I think because I was there, I think he probably would have spoken Armenian, except my friend and I were there. So he gave his homily, and he said, life is like a football game. Today we have the great Super Bowl, and life is like a football game. He said, when we do a good deed, we get a first down. But when we sin, we fumble the ball. Pretty good, right? And he said, and there are two teams. There are two teams. There's the team of God and the team of the devil. For the church, for our team, God is the head coach. And Satan is the head coach of the other team. But every team has not only a head coach, but assistant coaches. And the assistant coaches of our team are the Pope and the bishops. Now my friend, his name is Bill and I are sitting on the edge of our chairs because, of course, the Pope and bishops are human beings. And if the assistant coaches are human beings, we're waiting to see who are going to be the assistant coaches for the devil's team. And Father Luke says, and the assistant coaches for the devil's team are the colleges and universities. Yes, ma'am.
I was born of Irish parents, and St. Patrick's Day used to be a Catholic religious holiday. We annually went to New York and we marched with the county, Cabin and Monaghan. No one asked us what our sexuality was. No one asked us if we were married, gay, straight, single. We just got in line and we marched. I think now that on March 1st, St. Patrick goes into hiding in heaven. There's a special place. He goes there and he comes out about the 28th of March. I believe, and I'm asking you your opinion, that Cardinal Dolan gave up a huge opportunity to profess himself as the Catholic, as a cardinal of the church in this past parade. And I don't think it'll ever be the same after this.
Yeah. I give my advice to Cardinal Dolan privately rather than publicly. I think you'd be pleased with the advice I give Cardinal Dolan, or the discussions we have after things like what happened in New York happen. So I'll not here, share publicly what I have shared with him, but I will say this. We are at fault when we permit our institutions to secularize. And that goes for holidays like St. Patrick's Day or Christmas or Easter, and it goes for institutions like Georgetown and Boston College and Notre Dame. I have to tell you, honestly, I'm glad I've made my academic career in the secular universities. I've never been associated with a Catholic I was educated in secular universities. I teach in secular universities. In a secular university like Princeton or Harvard, I might be an oddity, but I'm not the enemy. In so many of our Catholic institutions that have tried to emulate the secular institutions, a guy like me would be an enemy, not merely an oddity, because there's so much hostility to the church's teachings in some of these institutions. Now, not all. We have Franciscan University of Steubenville. Notre Dame is a mixed bag. There's good and bad. It's not completely secularized, although it's certainly have been some trends in that direction that you know very well. But we can't just blame the bishops. I mean, the Second Vatican Council teaches us that it's fundamentally the job of the laity to be the salt and light in the world. Now, it would be good if the bishops helped us and cooperated with us, but we shouldn't be sitting back and waiting to see what they do. We should be in the public square, and certainly in our own institutions, fighting for the integrity, the Catholic integrity of those institutions, like St. Patrick's Day, like the universities. We should be the ones who are putting Christ back into Christmas. We don't need to rely on the bishops to do that. I hope, it'd be nice if they didn't get in our way. And it'd be really nice to have their support, and some do give it. I mean, think of the wonderful things Archbishop Chaput in Philadelphia has done, or Salvatore Cordileone in San Francisco. There are others as well. But we mustn't let our, in many cases, justified annoyance with some mistakes that some bishops make. We mustn't let that be an excuse for our sitting back and not doing anything. We've got to exercise some leadership here, we the laity. Yes, Mr. McLean?
Church has 2,000 years of history, and so over 2,000 years of history, we face some pretty bad times, the popes, scandals. And I was taught in the Jesuit universities years ago, when the Jesuits,
I went to a Jesuit university, St. Peter's in Jersey City, but at that time they were liberal, but not in the way liberal is meant now. They would open your mind, but to the church and so on. The church has come through a lot, and I'm trying to get in my mind, are we at a worse situation now? In other words, we have Blessed Mother hearing of Lord's and Sister Faustina having revelations in Christ, which are really dramatic if you look at the lesson they said as far as what sins are causing. But what do you see where we're heading? Is this going to be another cycle where the church is going to, the church is always going to be here, we know that, but is it going to take, and I use this word because people don't like, what, so divine intervention? Or are we going to work our way out of this? You see the wars all over the world. They're in complete chaos. And now we have weapons that can destroy the world. So are we heading for a divine intervention type thing, which the Blessed Mother kind of hinted in Lord and Fatima? And Sister Faustina was defeated by Christ. His mercy is available, but people aren't coming to get it. So where do you see we're headed?
Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you, Mr. McLean. Well, remember, I'm the guy who does not believe in inevitability of anything. So I don't think that there's a determinate course of history or that history is determined. I think that history is contingent, and much depends on what we do. It's open to human activity, human deliberation, judgment, and choice. So there's not really an answer to the question, where's it heading, as if that already exists somewhere out there. It's contingent. So we've got to do what we can. But we can learn some lessons from history. And I think the answer to your first question is, no, the situation now isn't worse than it's ever been. The church has, as you pointed out, gone through many rough times. And to link it back to the question of our Irish friend, we've gone through some times when the bishops, the great majority of bishops, were in open heresy. It was the laity that saved the church from the heresy of Arianism, when the bishops had gone over into that heresy. The laity stood up for the integrity of the faith. and brought the bishops back round, to the true apostolic witness. So we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the disappointments that we sometimes have from the bishops. It's sort of our job. There have been periods of persecution under the Romans, obviously, before Constantine. There have been terrible periods when false doctrines such as Gnosticism, the particular one that's probably was the most dangerous, Manichaeism, that was just sweeping through vast swaths of the Christian church. The church has been very weak at some periods in the past, but it's always revived. I mean, a remnant, as in Israel, as in the people of God in the Old Testament. Israel would get into pretty bad shape, but there would be a remnant of the people who would, by fidelity to God, through prayer, through action, restore, revive, cause a revival. It's our Protestant friends who often talk in terms of revival. We usually don't use that word in the Catholic Church, but we believe in the same thing. As Catholics, we're accustomed to the language of renewal. The Second Vatican Council was supposed to renew the church, and I still have faith that it might yet renew the church. The council itself was very good. You read the documents, fantastic. We shouldn't blame the council. But the council, as Pope Benedict said, is just terribly implemented and badly misinterpreted, including by many of the church's most prominent and famous theologians who treat it as an excuse to simply acquiesce to the way of the world, rather than becoming leaven in the world to revitalize and renew the world itself. So my bottom line is, we've had times as bad and even worse than this. The way we got out of those was with prayer and action, and in many cases it was the laity, not the bishops, that had to lead the way, and in some cases it was the laity going up against the bishops. Yes, sir?
When you're debating somebody on same-sex unions, and they say it's really just a matter of basic human rights, and they'll refer back to the way people used to view interracial marriage and pretty much put it in the same category. Not saying that, it's a Catholic marriage, not saying it's a marriage, but that if it's two people who love each other, who have a preference for the same sex, what is wrong with that?
Okay. Now, he said you hear the standard argument all the time. Look, if two people love each other, it doesn't matter whether they're opposite sex or same sex, it's the same thing. It's love that makes them, right? You didn't say this, but essentially what you're saying in so many words is it's love that makes the marriage. It's not sexual complementarity. So if two people love each other, why shouldn't they be regarded as marriage, whether they're same sex or opposite sex? And to deny that, isn't that to deny just a basic human right? Isn't that just like being opposed to interracial marriage in the Old South? Have I accurately captured it? Okay. First of all, let's deal with this interracial marriage business, okay? Where did interracial marriage prohibitions come from? Did we find them in the ancient world? Did we find them in Greece, in Rome? No, you didn't actually. They're modern inventions of modern racism. Oh, you had tribalism. We all know about tribalism. But the very concept of race is a modern pseudoscientific concept put into place to justify, to rationalize a deeply evil system of subordination, oppression, and exploitation. The reason that interracial marriages were forbidden in the places they were forbidden, the relatively few places in which they were forbidden across the globe, across history, was because of the desire to reinforce that system of racial exploitation and subordination. Is there anybody, anywhere, I mean, go to the most liberal, extreme university history departments you can find. Go to Brown, who will tell you that the idea of marriage as a man and a woman in Plato, in Aristotle, in Xenophanes, in Musonius, in Plutarch, in St. Augustine, in St. Thomas Aquinas, in Immanuel Kant, in Gandhi, the great hero Gandhi, was the product of a system of exploitation and subordination? The answer is no. It was not born of anything like racism. Do you know where we got the idea of marriage? Do a little thought experiment. Do a little thought experiment. Let's imagine that human beings, like some creatures, reproduce not sexually but asexually. Amoebas don't reproduce sexually, right? There's some creatures that reproduce but without sex. It's possible. What if human beings were like that? What if everything else about us was the same, but we didn't have the same reproductive structures because we don't reproduce sexually? We reproduce like amoebas or something, asexually. You know, you wake up in the morning, there's a little human baby there. If human beings reproduced asexually, would anybody ever have dreamed up, thought up, imagined the idea of marriage? No. That tells you where the idea of marriage came from. Right off the bat, you know that marriage is about procreation and reproductivity in its fundamental intelligibility. And it's not some rationalization, some scheme, some law put into effect to reinforce an unjust system of exploitation and subordination. So I would say to my interlocutor, my friend, cut it out with the racism stuff. It's silly. Okay, now, human right, okay. So, where does this human right come from? God? Where does God say, the man shall leave his mother, and the other man shall leave his mother, and the two will cleave together, but they won't become one flesh because they don't have the equipment? So it's not God, okay. Is it nature? Oh, you believe in natural law. Well, we've got a very long and sophisticated tradition. It goes back to Brother Aristotle, up through St. Thomas Aquinas, the Enlightenment thinkers. Did any of them come up with the idea of same-sex marriage? Where's this human right come from? It's not God. It's not nature. I mean, am I supposed to believe it's a human right because you tell me it's a human right? You discovered it in 1996? You need an argument. You need something to back it up. And by the way, you say if two people love each other. Now, the presupposition of the possibility of two people of the same sex being married is that marriage is an emotional or affective unity. It can't be that it's a bodily unity because there's no way to affect biological unity between, whether they're human beings or other creatures, animals of the same sex. You know, you can do rubbing together, you can create other, you can do stuff. But what you will not have is biological unity. Ask any anatomist or any farmer. So if marriage is purely affective unity, unity at the affective level, and not conjugal, not the multi-level union whose foundation and matrix is biological, then yes, two people of the same sex, you're right, can be emotionally united. But so can three. So can five. If it's purely an emotional bond, we're not talking about polygamy here, by the way. We're talking about what's called polyamory. You know about the Massachusetts throuple? Three ladies together as a sexual partnership. They have sex as a group. They cook together. They're having three kids. A girl for you, a girl for me, a girl for the other one. It's picture you upon my knee, a girl for you, and a girl for me, and a girl for her. One girl, one of the ladies, is having all the children because she's the natural mother. But they're going to be three, one for each. They already got one. And they're a throuple. And they want to know, why is this not a marriage? And you know what? If you believe that two persons of the same sex can be married, then that means you believe that marriage is an affective or emotional union and not a biological union, which means there is no reason the throuple can't be married. The throuple has as much of a marriage as the couple, and the quadruple as much as the throuple or the couple. And so it also goes with all the other norms. Notice this. Once you've abandoned the idea of conjugality, that marriage is a multi-level sharing of life, not just an affective union, a union at the biological, emotional, rational dispositional, spiritual. Once you've abandoned that in favor of the idea that it's purely an emotional union, then you cannot account for why marriage should be closed sexually rather than open. Why have a norm of fidelity? Now, the individual couple might, as a matter of subjective preference, prefer monogamy, prefer exclusivity, but that's just a psychological preference. It's like liking chocolate rather than vanilla. There's no principled basis for it. Same for permanence. Why should it be permanent? If marriage is an emotional union, the marriage exists as long as the emotional union exists, right? As soon as the emotional union is gone, the marriage is over. It's just the shell of a marriage. But more importantly than that, why even pledge permanence? Since love comes and goes. Love's considered not as volitional, but as affective, as emotional. Why not do what's now being proposed in Mexico City? Have marriages contracted for 5 years renewable. Yeah, it's being proposed in Mexico City. And it makes perfect sense. You accept the premise of same-sex marriage, you've got that. That logically, you have no argument against it. And the idea that marriage is dyadic, that's the fancy word for meaning that it's 2 persons rather than 3 or 4 or 5 in a polyamorous partnership. In other words, all the norms of marriage lose their principled basis, and the idea of marriage itself dissolves. That's what's really at stake. It's the very concept of marriage in our law and culture. Now, you might live off the capital for a little while. Sure, you can live off the capital. People kind of have it in their heads at the moment that, well, marriage is, it's 2, right? It's 2. I mean, it can be same sex, but it's 2. But of course, that has no more secure basis than the belief 30 years ago that, well, marriage is a man and woman. It's not 2 men. Granny used to be able to make jokes on Beverly Hillbillies about, Jethro hasn't figured out yet that, it's boys and girls, not boys and boys. You can't make those jokes anymore. There's a principle that's at stake here, a principle that supports the whole idea of marriage and all its norms, which is lost once you give up the idea of conjugality. And you have already seen, as I'm in my I told you so mood now, you already see that if marriage is lost, if the principle of conjugality in marriage is lost, religious freedom is down the tubes. Because all you will hear when you assert your right not to participate in other people's decisions to enter into same-sex marriages, that all you will hear is that you are claiming a right to discriminate, and there is no such thing as a right to discriminate. I warned people who wanted to make a deal, 5 years ago. Look, the idea that one side should accept same-sex marriage and the other side in return accepts religious liberty, no way that would ever hold. The only way to protect religious liberty is to protect marriage. You lose on marriage, very little hope of protecting religious liberty. We have to do the best we can, but very little hope of actually protecting it, and I think I've been vindicated in my prediction this week. Yes, ma'am?
Well, you were quoted in the Wall Street Journal this morning saying that very thing.
I was quoted in the Journal this morning? Oh, yeah.
So,
Did they spell my name right? No. It's just kidding.
all right, so on a very practical basis here, moral witness in the public square, okay? I have friends who are gay. I have friends who've had abortions. They know that I'm Catholic. They know that I'm pro-life. They know that I believe in conjugal marriage as a man and a woman. How far, because as a Christian, we're called to love our neighbors. My neighbors are 2 women that live together. So how far do we go with asserting what we believe and not becoming kind of the old school Southern Baptist? I mean, I have a tradition of that in my family, where it's, you're absolutely wrong, you're a sinner, you're going to hell. That's a really tough thing for me.
I don't hear much these days from that side. The people I hear calling other people sinners who are going to hell are the pro-same-sex marriage people, right? Okay.
I agree.
So,
You have to stand up and say,
right.
You've got it wrong, I have my beliefs, these are my beliefs, why I believe it,
That's right.
and hold your ground.
Right, exactly right. You don't need to be a scold, and you shouldn't be a scold. Your point isn't to beat people over the head with the Bible or that microphone. She's not bringing it for that purpose. You know, but the key thing is what was in your first sentence. My neighbors know where I stand. You bear witness when your neighbors know where you stand. You don't have to attack them. You don't have to call them names. You don't have to call them sinners. You don't have to tell them they're going to hell. That's a bad approach. You're not going to win anybody over that way. But they need to know where you stand, and your children and your grandchildren need to know where you stand. You have to bear witness to them. And when push comes to shove and you're put on the spot, you can't go silent. There's the famous episode when the great Catholic novelist, Flannery O'Connor, the great Southern Catholic novelist, Flannery O'Connor was she was invited to a fancy dinner with the elite, you know, the literati, the glitterati, the fancy people, the beautiful people, you know, people who would disdain her Catholic faith, but because she was famous and an important novelist, she gets invited along, and she's at the dinner table, and they're talking at the dinner table about how, well, you know, Christianity has some really, you know, it has some nice moral teachings. You should be good to each other, and so forth. But you know, there are certain things that Catholicism teaches that, you know, obviously no one can believe, like that the bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. You know, that's just a symbol, and you know, it's not anything that a serious, intellectually sophisticated person can believe. And Flannery O'Connor, who was not an aggressive person, who was a quiet person, but couldn't just sit there without bearing witness, Flannery O'Connor said, well, if it's just a symbol, then the hell with it. She made her point. She made her point. So sometimes the witness can be soft, absolutely right, but it's got to be there. It can't be going quiet. It can't be backing away. It can't be pretending to go along. It can't be hiding. My old friend, my old Southern Baptist friend, Chuck Colson, who died a few years ago, you know, the Watergate guy who became an evangelical preacher, we became very close friends. He once put it in a very nice way. He said that, a very effective way, he said that you don't want to face God at the end of your life if you haven't compiled enough evidence of your being a Christian that you could be convicted of Christianity in a court of law. So that's a pretty good, what do the people call it, a heuristic device, a way of thinking. Have I given witness enough that I could be convicted in a court of law? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank you for talking. It's not the end, but...
Yeah, thank you. Oh, but it's getting late, actually.
Well, when you got to the part of contingent history,
Yeah.
I will have to watch the video again, but you gave me a lot of hope, because I think you said, as you're saying now, take little steps to be true to God. You know, be strong if you have to speak up.
That's it, yeah.
I appreciate all that you face, because you're head-to-head with the, you know, the intellectuals of today. But you give me hope, and I thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'll try to be a better disciple.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we all, we all have to do our little parts, and not all of us have the same. Look, I don't want to lead people to think that I think all of us have the same vocabulary. They all have to be big mouths like me and go out there and get in the Wall Street Journal and all that stuff. We all, in our little ways, are asked to bear witness. Now, sometimes that's going to come with heavy costs, though. I mean, everything I said is true. But do remember, and I'm glad you brought up that point about the contingency of history. There really isn't. No one should ever fall for this idea that there's a right and wrong side of history, and that you need to get yourself on the side that's going to end up the winner. We really do need to be focused, concerned on whether we're on the right side of truth, not whether we're on the right side of history. History is contingent. It's just a sequence of events. It's impersonal. The idea that history possesses powers of judgment, an idea that was initially developed by the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, and then picked up by Karl Marx, the great architect, the deviser of communism. That idea was essentially proposed as an alternative to religion, alternative to God. It's a pseudo-religion. Everything that they say about history is just a secularized version of God. They put history in the role of God as a kind of divine judge, having these divine powers to judge. But when you think about it, it's silly. History is impersonal. The idea of God, if God exists, the very idea of God is that God is a personal reality. The atheists don't think he exists, but if he exists, they know what they're looking for. They know what they're denying. They're denying a personal reality, just as we in affirming God are affirming a personal reality, a person. I actually think three persons in one God. History, nobody believes that history is personal. When you just sit down and think about it, it has no power to judge you. It has no power to track you down. It's an impersonal, contingent sequence of events, and it's malleable. It's not something that has already happened, but we don't know about it yet. What we do shapes it, affects it. And I think there really is grounds for hope. Yes, sir.
Professor, how do we instill that hope in our college-age students?
It's very hard. I have to do it all the time. It's tough on these kids, and especially the ones that are solid and wanting to stand up for the truths of the faith. In my own work, the most valuable thing I think I can offer them is a sense of how to make the arguments to defend the positions that at some level they know are correct, and yet in the intellectual culture we find ourselves in, they find it difficult to articulate them. Because the terms of discourse are so loaded against them. But I don't know if any of you have read the book that I co-authored with my two former students, Sharif Girgis and Ryan Anderson, called What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense, available in paperback, inexpensive paperback. Here are two young guys. They're Father Mike, they were a few years after you? Yeah, so they're even younger than Father Mike, who seems to me just like he's 14. But Sharif and Ryan are now, the most powerful nobody can stand up against Sharif, right? I've seen him take apart, important philosophers with endowed chairs. The guy's a grad student at Princeton. Now, he's a really smart grad student. He's a Rhodes Scholar, summa cum laude. He's doing his PhD at Princeton in philosophy while also completing his law degree at Yale. Yes, he's a really smart guy. But, he's still just a kid, and he's got this ability. He's armed with arguments, and he's got the determination and the will to stand up against famous philosophers and make mincemeat of them. At some point, C-SPAN, Google, C-SPAN, and Sharif Girgis, G-I-R-G-I-S, he's Coptic, comes from a Coptic Egyptian Christian background. And just Google his C-SPAN debate with Professor Andrew Koppelman at Harvard Law School. That's unbelievable. Sharif has the whole audience against him. He's up against the holder of an endowed chair at Northwestern University Law School, former colleague of mine at Princeton, Andrew Koppelman, sophisticated guy. Sharif demolishes him on this issue. So, one thing, there are some good materials out there, like that book somebody wrote called What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense? Put that in the hands of your young people. The ones who want to defend the church's position will welcome the arguments. The others might resist, thinking, it's just Dad trying to, get me to buy into his old fogey Catholic ways. But, if it's sitting there, at some point, he's going to be curious enough to open it. And then he's going to find some really challenging points, things that'll get him thinking. Is it quite so easy, after all, simply to say, love makes a family? So the resources are there, and I think we need to make them available for our young people. The other thing is that our young people need to see our own witness. They need to see some courage from us. If we look like we're hiding, they're not going to, they'll just cave. You've had your hand up in the back for a long time, sir, yeah?
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for being here tonight. Do you think the Catholic laity will stand up in the next 20 years and we'll have some sort of civil war? Will this be ugly?
Again, I'm the guy who believes that history is contingent, so I have no way of predicting whether Catholics will stand up. But judging again from history and, informed by Christ's promise that the gates of hell will never prevail against the church, so with that promise in the background, time and time again throughout history we've seen a remnant people, not the majority, but a minority, and sometimes a very small minority, preserve the faith and rekindle the flame. So I have to say, as a matter of faith, gates of hell will not prevail against her, that yes, I don't know if it'll be 20 years, it might be 100 years, I don't know. We might, for all we know, my doctoral supervisor, the magisterial Catholic philosopher, John Finnis, once said something to me that struck me. I'm not sure why I had never thought of this before myself, but it really struck me when he said it. We always tend to think we're living near the end, in the end times. We're not quite like some of our Protestant friends who think that, it's going to be August 26, 2016. But, we still think, Christianity's been around a long time, Jesus isn't going to tarry that much longer. Well, Professor Finnis once said to me, we don't know whether we are now living in the earliest days of Christianity. That the distance between us and the apostles might be just tiny by comparison with the centuries upon centuries, the millennia into the future in which the church may persist as Jesus tarries. We don't know. So we need to keep this truly Catholic world historical time frame in mind. We don't have to think it's our responsibility to make everything right tomorrow or next week or even in the next 10 years or even the next 100 years. Father, another great friend of mine who died, I miss him so much every day, Father Richard John Newhouse, used to say all the time, he would always call me by both my names. He would never call me Robbie. He would say, Robbie George, Robbie George. He'd say, Robbie George, you're too eager for victory. Said, you want to win this thing yourself. Said, but you got to remember, the winning and the losing, the winning is not up to us. That's not our job. That's God's job. Our job is to be faithful, stand at our station, do our duty, proclaim the gospel, take the slings and arrows, set an example of being willing to stand up in the face of the fire. That's all God's asking us to do. The victory, that's up to God, on His terms, in His time. You're not in charge of that. He's in charge of that. You do your job. You're not the general. You're a private. I wanted to at least be a corporal, but I'm private. I should probably just do one more question and then, yeah, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. Talk about being inarticulate. The one place I have trouble pushing back on the cafeteria Catholic is in vitro fertilization.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Here's my beautiful child here. How can you tell me it's a bad idea? What are your thoughts?
Well, Catholics are famous. We are infamous. We are notorious for rejecting a school of thought, a way of thinking about ethics that my dear friend Aileen Collins here will recognize as utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is the school of thought whose great founder was the secular philosopher Jeremy Bentham, whose most prominent contemporary disciple is Peter Singer, my colleague at Princeton. Utilitarianism says, at the end of the day, what makes an action good or bad is simply the result, simply the consequences. If the consequences are net good, then the action couldn't have been bad. Now, to the extent that you've imbibed consequentialism, whether you know it or not, or utilitarianism is another word for consequentialism, to the extent that you've imbibed this utilitarian ethic, and many of our people have, including many Catholics without even knowing it, they're going to be impressed by that argument. They're going to say, it was the baby, and of course, the baby's magnificent, it's a beautiful baby, the precious human being. How can there be anything wrong with that? But of course, we Catholics don't think that way. The good consequences, that's great. We love that baby. That baby has as much dignity, rights, precious as any other human being in the whole world. But our question is, can you do just anything in order to bring about good consequences? the evaluation of the morality of the act doesn't have to do with the consequences as such. It's with the intention that's formed in trying to bring about the consequences. Do we want to adopt? Here's what the church is teaching us. It's asking us this question. Do we want to adopt a view of procreation that essentially reduces it to a species of manufacture? If we adopt a view of procreation which reduces it to a species of manufacture, then we are implicitly adopting a view of the relationship of producer and product. And of course, producer is always superior to product. Producer is end, product is the status of mere means. Okay? And if we do that, then there's some things that are predictable. And all we need to ask is, do they in fact happen? Anybody in the production business here? Anybody to produce things, factory? Yeah, okay. Now.
I'm not in the production business, but I worked many years in adoption
In-
for Catholic charity. I'm a psychologist.
Oh, okay. But is there anybody here who makes products?
In vitro, we have the seminaries I've attended in moral theology. There's always 4 or 5, 6, 7 zygotes. It has to be narrowed down to 1 or 2. Which of those zygotes is going to be the chosen child? Because you can prove
Right.
it's something like a 12% rate don't survive if you leave them all in there, and they do not fertilize to put in 1 egg, 1 sperm. No. So that's the thing. It really is abortion before the cell starts dividing.
Took the words out of my mouth. Exactly right. Where I was going with this, the reason I was asking whether there are people who produce products, and it goes right to what this our friend here, the psychologist, says, is that we apply, when we produce products, standards that we call quality controls. We want the best product, right? And when you've adopted an attitude toward an entity as a product, because you're in a producer-product relationship, we're going to want quality controls. Now, what do we do with quality controls, right? As you said, I'm just going to repeat what the lady said now, because she's absolutely right. We have to overproduce the embryos. In order to get an embryo to implant, we need to actually try with a set of embryos. Now, we select. We're starting to do the embryo screening. We select the healthiest, and the others we discard. Or we put in cryopreservation to put them in this never land state. You remember the debate about embryonic stem cell research was all about 500,000 human embryos, precious human lives at the earliest stage of development, distinct, unique human beings, just at a very early developmental stage, in this permanent never land of cryopreservation. Not alive, well, not technically alive, certainly not dead, but not able to grow, not able to develop, just there in this state of suspended animation. That's what we buy into. And the church in her wisdom, everybody else has caved on this, right? I mean, it's just a Catholic church. It's just a Catholic church standing almost alone. And look who's been proven right. The Catholic Church. Everybody else was saying, well, gee, how can you be against it? It's just another way of having a baby. Just another way of having a baby. It just doesn't involve bodily union. It's just another way of getting that beautiful thing, a baby. And here we are now with, at this point, probably more than 1 million embryos in cryopreservation. If we did this worldwide, I'd have no idea what the number would be. Applying quality controls, doing embryo screening, deciding which of these human lives is good enough, which is inferior, which is superior, down the wrong road, as so often proves to be the case. Those old fuddy-duddy popes, who everybody thinks are just such dinosaurs, they put out their encyclicals on these moral questions while the world is going forward into the brave new world where everything is going to be great and we've solved all our problems because now we have this new technique that's going to solve everything. And who turns out to be right? The fuddy-duddy old pope. Father Mike, thank you so much for having me. Oh, sure. One last question. Did somebody have a question? Is it you? I thought I answered all your questions in class 20 years ago. Father Mike.
I was wondering, in June, the Supreme Court is supposed to make a decision on same-sex marriage. Could that, you think, ratchet up pressure on religious groups like ourselves?
Oh, it will.
What could be an effect of that?
Yeah. I mean, the likely result, I'm very sad to say, is that the court will impose, it'll redefine marriage across the whole country. It'll abolish the conjugal conception of marriage, claim that it's unconstitutional. Little did the framers and ratifiers of the 14th Amendment in 1868 knew that what they were actually doing was creating same-sex marriage. But that's what the court's going to say they did. I think it's very likely. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. Never have I ever wanted to be wrong as much as I want to be wrong about this. But if I were a betting man, I'd bet that that's the way it goes. Now, the trouble from there you've seen in Indiana, right? So it's going to be Knights of Columbus halls. Photographers who are being asked to use their artistic talents to participate in a celebration of conduct that from a Catholic point of view, we don't want to be harsh, but from a Catholic point of view is immoral. There's no choice around that. So it'll be a very effective way of cleansing. You've heard of ethnic cleansing, that terrible thing that happened, for example, in the Balkans, ethnic and in Africa, ethnic cleansing. This will cleanse Catholics and evangelicals and Orthodox Jews from a whole range of businesses that supply the wedding industry. Photographers, bakers, caterers, people who provide halls, including church halls. Now, of course, they've always said all along that, well, we're never going to require clergy to perform same-sex ceremonies. Here, sir, is where push is going to come to shove on your issue. Because what will be threatened then is the tax-exempt status of faiths whose clergy refused, and the church will have to decide, are we going to do same-sex marriages, or are we going to have our tax-exempt status revoked? And then the bishops will really be on the spot. They will do the right thing, but it will come at a heavy cost. As I've often said, are you familiar with the concept of dimitude? In the Ottoman period, under the Ottoman Turks, certain non-Muslims, particularly, specifically Christians and Jews, as people of the book, were tolerated. They weren't forced to change religion. They weren't killed or anything like that. But there were certain things they couldn't do, certain offices they couldn't hold, and they were taxed with a special tax called the dhimmi tax, D-H-I-M-M-I. That was dimitude. Now, this is another whole issue. One of the other ways I'm notorious is that I'm actually not hostile to Islam. I'm very hostile to radical Islam. I think you've seen my work on ISIS and so forth. But I think that we have a lot in common with our Muslim fellow citizens here in the United States, and I do not see them as a threat. There are some radical elements. So when people say, especially conservatives, I generally regard it as a conservative, say they fear being placed under dimitude by Muslims, I say your worry about dimitude should not be about your Muslim neighbors. They do not want to put you under dimitude. They don't want to re-establish the Ottoman Turkish Caliphate. ISIS is another story, but down on Route 1, the Islamic Center of Central Jersey, Imam Ahmed, yeah, right. He does not want to put us under dimitude. If we end up with second-class status, excluded from some professions, having our tax-exempt status revoked, it won't be the Muslims who do it to us. It will be the people on the other side of the culture war. It'll be the secularists on the other side of the culture war who put Catholics and evangelicals and Orthodox Jews and Muslims in that position. There's already a case in Idaho in which a married couple who are pastors who have their own independent church and who do weddings as a commercial business, but under religious auspices and as religious ceremonies. They're genuine pastors, they're not hucksters. Because they are paid for wedding services, I think, Father Mike, people will slip you a couple of $100 or something. I don't know what the going rate is now, but these folks actually will present a bill when they marry you. They are now being told they are required to do same-sex marriages, even though they are pastors, even though they run a religious service. So I wouldn't believe even that promise now. I used to believe it. I no longer believe even that promise that clergy won't be implicated. I thank you all very, very much for coming out to hear me and being with me. Thank you. Thank you.